According to an ancient Chinese proverb, each generation shall reap what the former generation has sown. This is why economists and environmentalists nowadays are continuously working together in slowing down the rate of depletion of our natural resources. Since most developing countries rely on the environment as a form of livelihood to sustain their needs, economists have emphasized the importance of ensuring environmental sustainability, which will be further discussed in the preceding slides. It should be noted that environmental issues affect and are also affected by economic development. In this chapter, we will talk about what these issues are and what can be done to resolve poverty cycles and resource degradation in achieving worldwide sustainable development. Under the topics of basic issues in environment and development, scope, mitigation, and adaptation of global warming and climate change, economic models of environmental issues, urban development and the environment, local and global costs of rainforest destruction, and lastly, the policy options in developing and developed countries. As I've mentioned earlier, in order to achieve economic development and slow down resource depletion, we must secure a development path that prioritizes environmental sustainability. Sustainability refers to meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of the future generations. It can also be associated with the increase of capital assets. However, natural resources are only substitutes to a limited scale or degree, and once the environment is depleted of these resources, natural and other capital assets eventually act as complements to physical or material capital. For this reason, exhausting natural resources and other capital stock is not a sustainable approach. It is implied that growth and development will only be achieved if we improve the quality of the environment that we live in. This highlights the need for environmental accounting, which calculates the environmental costs and benefits of various economic activities to determine whether there is an increase or decrease of environmental capital. This makes environmental accounting an important element in making better economic decisions. Another necessary assessment of economic development is the correct measure of NNI, or Sustainable Net National Income. With the use of NNI, we can determine how much capital assets a country can consume sustainably, which prevents the overall assets from diminishing. The formula for NNI is shown, and to get the NNI, or Sustainable National Income, we subtract the depreciation of manufactured capital assets and depreciation of environmental capital from the gross national income. The NNI also includes the costs of activities intended to delay or reverse an environmental degradation. With the increase in both population and the depletion of our natural resources, it is a major concern that over the course of time, the next generations will no longer receive the benefits of our resources necessary for their survival, such as clean air and water. This points to rapid population growth and poverty as a strong factor in environmental degradation, wherein people living in poverty become both victims and agents of environmental decay. Living in environmentally degraded lands with a weak political influence and not enough resources to work their way out of poverty make them victims of environmental degradation. And in the same way, high fertility and insecure land tenure make them agents, which is why policies must address issues with land tenure and provide institutional support to the poor. Other issues of environment and development require progressive changes in the support and resources provided in the agriculture sector to increase food production and stop the overexploitation of land in rural areas. Furthermore, most of the population rely on natural resources as a means of sustenance, and due to the new private property rights arrangements and corrupt public land management, people, especially those living in poverty, are losing their claim on their agricultural resources, such as forests, fields, and fishing areas, which also leads to the loss of agricultural productivity. Both the urban and the rural poor share the same problems regarding the lack of sanitation procedures and potable water, dependence on biomass fuels like wood, straw, and manure, which are the main culprit for dangerously high levels of airborne pollutants. A theory known as the environmental Kuznets curves reflects the concept that pollution and other environmental degradation first rises and then falls in an inverted U pattern once there is an increase in income per capita. It is believed that as incomes rise, societies will have both the means and the willingness to pay for environmental protection. However, there is no evidence convincing enough to prove the claims of this theory. This is because environmental pollution itself may cause slow economic growth, and other economic factors result in an unstable rise and fall of pollution levels and income per capita, whatever the pattern of the Kuznets figure may be.
So let's now proceed to the second topic, the global warming and climate change scope, mitigation, and adaptation. So first, the scope. The IPCC issued its fourth assessment report in 2007. It indicated that the developing world, particularly the poorest countries, can expect serious repercussions from global warming, including larger and much more severe heat waves and higher average temperatures, hurricanes, floods from heavy rains, prolonged droughts, the extinction of valuable species, crop and fishing losses, and other effects. According to IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are four zones highly vulnerable to greenhouse gas induced climate change. And these are first, the sub-Saharan Africa because of drying. Sub-Saharan Africa will be particularly affected. The IPCC report concluded that while adaptations would help in certain regions such as the Ethiopian highlands would benefit from longer growing seasons, conditions would already worsen by 2020. Second, the Asian megadeltas because of flooding. Millions of people in Asia live in low-lying areas in the path of typhoons that are expected to become more frequent and intense, or in areas that are more vulnerable to ocean or river flooding. Flooding also poses a threat to both rural and urban infrastructure. Later on in the century, South Asia will face more droughts, water shortages, and agricultural productivity declines. So, next, the small islands due to multiple sensitivities. As a result of their sensitivity and vulnerability to ocean flooding, erosion, and loss of fresh water, fishing, and tourism, many small islands are at risk. And lastly, the Arctic widespread melting of snow and ice. Scientists are concerned about the massive polar ice melt in the summer and its implications for the future. From June to September 2007, the Arctic experienced record sea ice melt, falling far short of the previous record low set in September 2005. According to the National Snow and Ice Data Center, sea ice extent fell to 4.13 million square kilometers on September 16, 2007, 38% below average and 24% below the 2005 record. Recent follow-up reports have amplified findings and concerns. The 2010 US NOAA study found evidence of global warming due to greenhouse gases on all 11 indicators examined. According to National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the combined global land and ocean surface temperature for 2010 tied with 2005 as the warmest such period on record at 0.62 degrees Celsius above the 20th century average of 13.9 degrees Celsius. And next, the 2012 and 2013 Turn Down the Heat reports show severity of consequences for developing countries. Turn Down the Heat, a sobering 2012 study published by the World Bank, argued that the world will face a 4-degree increase in average global temperatures this century, with disastrous consequences. Its 2013 follow-up study focused on the effects that have already been felt after only a zero point 0.8 degrees Celsius temperature rise, such as extreme weather events and sea level rise. According to the report, the expected 2-degree rise in 20 to 30 years will cause food shortages in Africa and water crisis in South Asia. Extreme heat waves, rising sea level, storms, droughts, floods, and loss of grasslands, farmlands, and marine ecosystems will occur as the temperature rises above 2 degrees, approaching 4 degrees. And next, the impact of global warming is likely hardest on the poorest countries. The very poor who rely the most on natural resources, including rain-fed agriculture, will most likely suffer the greatest burden of the consequences. Furthermore, poor housing in both urban and rural areas is frequently poorly constructed and located in the most environmentally stressed and dangerous areas, largely because the rich do not want to live there. Poor people's homes made of mud, bamboo, straw, and other cheap or easily gathered materials are the most vulnerable to extreme weather events. These are some of the impacts of climate change in developing countries identified by IPCC: prolonged droughts and expanded desertification, increased severity of storms with heavy precipitation and flooding and consequent erosion, longer and more severe heat waves, reduced summer river flow and water shortages, decreased grain yields, climate-induced spreading ranges of pests and disease, lost and contaminated groundwater, deteriorated freshwater lakes, coastal fisheries, mangroves and coral reefs, coastal flooding, loss of essential species such as pollinators and soil organisms, forest and crops fire, and lastly, the rising surface ozone levels. So, after scope, we now have the mitigation. So, how do we lessen it? First, development of carbon markets, taxes on carbon, and subsidies to encourage faster technological progress. As for regulation, given the uncertainties in both the benefits and costs of emissions reductions, determining the most efficient permit or emissions tax regimes poses difficult economic questions. And so, next, establishing long-term quantity cap on greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to guard against the environmental catastrophe. As a policy strategy, the Stern Review proposed long-term limits on the amount of greenhouse emissions equal to the amount that the Earth could absorb. In the short term, policies could be designed to reduce the economic burden if abatement costs prove to be unexpectedly high at first. And next, develop and implementing a mechanism for paying developing countries for forest prevention. So, policies and mechanisms have primarily been implemented to compensate developing countries for the costs of avoiding emissions. Deforestation in developing countries accounts for more than 20% of harmful greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to the loss of valuable biodiversity and environmental services such as air and water purification. So, assisting developing countries in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions has emerged as an important aspect of foreign aid. Indeed, the need of developing and implementing a mechanism for compensating developing countries for forest preservation has long been a hot topic in international climate change negotiations. And now we're currently at the last one, adaptation. While immediate mitigation action is required, significant climate change is now essentially unavoidable. Even if drastic mitigation begins immediately, lags in the climate system means that the change will take many years to manifest. As a result, adaptation to climate change in developing countries is critical for preserving livelihoods and advancing development. So, what is climate change adaptation? According to UNDP, it is a process by which strategies to moderate, cope with, and take advantage of the consequences of climatic events are enhanced, developed, and implemented. So, adaptation takes place in two forms. First, it is the policy or planned adaptation. It is undertaken by governments that respond directly to citizens, and government incentives affect what individuals choose to do. And next is the private or autonomous adaptation. It is undertaken directly by households, farms, and firms in response to climate change they experience or anticipate. Although the distinction between autonomous or private adaptation and planned or policy adaptation is not sharp, governments respond to citizens and government incentives influence what those individuals choose to do. The categories are useful for analyzing adaptation. These responses are both complements and substitutes in some ways. So, as I've mentioned, if autonomous adaptation increases the marginal benefit of planned adaptation and vice versa, they are considered complements. For example, when farmers respond to increasing temperature by planting new varieties, and government research institutes develop new heat-resistant seeds. But if autonomous adaptation reduces the need for planned adaptation and vice versa, then they are called substitutes. For example, if the government builds reservoirs and irrigation systems, farmers have less incentive to change crops or conserve water.
Next topic is the economic models of environment issues. In terms of privately owned resources and economic models, the neoclassical theory is applied to environmental issues to determine what conditions are necessary for the efficient allocation of resources and how market failures lead to inefficiencies, and to suggest ways in which these distortions can be corrected. This theory is focused on the premise that supply and demand are the driving force of the economy in relation to production, pricing, and consumption of goods. The proponents of neoclassical free market theory stress that inefficiencies in the allocation of resources result from impediments to the operation of the free market or imperfections in the property rights system. This means that resources will be allocated efficiently if these resources are privately owned. The perfect property rights markets are characterized by four conditions. First is universality, where all resources are privately owned. Second is exclusivity or excludability. From the term itself means it must be possible to prevent others from benefiting from a privately owned resource. Third is transferability, wherein the owner of a resource may sell the resource when desired. And lastly, enforceability, which means the intended market distribution of the benefits from resources must be enforceable. Under common property resources, any potential profits or scarcity rents will be competed away because the property is publicly owned. Privatization of resources will lead to an increase in aggregate welfare and an efficient allocation of resources. Conferring extended tenancy rights or ownership of land to family farmers would raise productivity. The question is, who should obtain title to the land if privatization were to occur? This is a graph under common property resources, which describes the relationship between the value per unit of labor on a given piece of land and the number of laborers cultivating it. We have noted in the previous slide that under neoclassical theory, insufficiencies will arise in the absence of scarcity rents. Society's total net benefit from land will be lower under a system of common property unless workers can coordinate their resource use decisions in a cooperative manner. Generally, if land is commonly owned, each worker is able to appropriate the entire product of his work, which is equal to the average product of all workers. Worker income will continue to exceed the wage until enough workers are attracted so that the average product falls to the level of the wage. The implication of the common property resource model is that where possible, privatization of resources will lead to an increase in aggregate welfare and an efficient allocation of resources. Elinor Ostrom, the 2009 Nobel laureate in economics, discovered that under some conditions, a fair and efficient management of common property can be achieved by the people who depend on it under 8 conditions. First is clearly defined boundaries of the resource system. Number 2 is proportional equivalence between benefits and costs, specifying the amount of resource products that a user is allocated. Number 3 is collective choice arrangements, wherein individuals affected by the harvesting and protection rules are included in the group who can modify these rules. Fourth is monitoring or actively audit biophysical conditions and user behavior. Number 5 is graduated sanctions, meaning those who violate rules are likely to receive sanctions depending on the seriousness of the offense. Sixth is conflict resolution mechanisms, where users and their officials have rapid access to low-cost arenas in order to resolve conflict among users. 7. At least minimal recognition of rights to organize, wherein the rights of users to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities. And lastly, for resources that are parts of larger systems, nested enterprises, or the appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, and governance activities are organized in multiple layers of nested enterprises. Next is public goods and bads, the regional environmental degradation, and the free rider problem. In the previous common property problem, The externalities associated with decreasing average product were easily internalized by establishing perfect property markets through the privatization of public property. In many cases, the internalization of externalities is not so easily accomplished. This is especially the case where the consequences of an individual's actions constitute a public good or a public bad. A public good is anything that provides benefit to everyone and the availability of which is in no way diminished by its simultaneous enjoyment by others. Common examples include clean air, economic institutions, and national defense. A public bad is any product or condition that decreases the well-being of others in a non-exhaustive manner. Air pollution and water pollution are examples. Intuitively, it is clear that given the fact that individuals do not pay the full costs associated with their actions, too much of a public bad will be produced. On the other hand, the free rider problem pertains to those who benefit from resources without any contribution. The difference between a public good and a purely private good is that aggregate demand for the public resource is determined by summing individual demand curves vertically, as in Figure 10.5a, rather than horizontally, as is the case for private goods, as illustrated in Figure 10.5b. In Figure 10.5a, the socially optimal number of trees is determined by the intersection of the vertically summed aggregate demand curve with the supply curve. At Q asterisk, total net benefits to society from the public good are maximized. However, due to what we call the free rider problem, the free market will not lead to this optimal quantity. Because individuals are able to enjoy the benefits of trees provided by others, each will contribute less than what he or she would if acting independently. It is important to note that the problem with the public good pricing mechanism is how to know which prices to charge. People have no incentive to divulge how much they really benefit from a public good because by shirking they may free ride on the contributions of others and avoid paying their full share. A government may be capable of reducing market inefficiencies, but it is unlikely to be able to produce a perfect allocation of resources due to deficiencies in the information available to it.
Now we're on the fourth topic, the urban development and the environment. In some ways, life among the poor in urban slums is similar to that of the poor in rural villages. So, what are the environmental problems of urban slums? First, families work long hours and income is uncertain. Though urban dwellers have higher incomes on average, the poorest are frequently at greater risk of being exposed to hazardous environmental conditions. Let us compare environmental conditions in an African and South American rural community to those in an Asian urban town. So, and next, difficult trade-offs must be made between expenditures on nutrition, medical care, and education, greater risk of being exposed to dangerous environmental conditions, health-threatening pollutants. Health-threatening pollutants are common both inside and outside the home in a typical Asian city slum. Many women are unaware that the smoke produced by the fuels they use in the home to cook and boil water can have serious long-term consequences for their children's health. Poor ventilation in the home can result in conditions equivalent to smoking several packs of cigarettes per day, and women and children are exposed to these fumes for long periods of the day. Though some children avoid much of this exposure by attending the school, but many are kept home to help their mothers. Next is debilitating and ultimately fatal respiratory infections. As a result, chronic and acute bronchitis is a cruel fact of life from a young age. Debilitating and ultimately fatal respiratory infections are common among the poor. And lastly, diarrhea. Individuals are exposed to harmful pollutants outside the home as well. Other pollutants are constantly present in the air that street vendors and market workers breathe. Untreated sewage flows in open drains alongside roads, allowing infectious diseases to spread. Diarrhea is common in young children because food and drinking water are frequently contaminated. Even when food is plentiful, frequent bouts of the illness cause malnourishment, making the young more vulnerable to other diseases. because the urban poor are less able to insulate themselves from the negative effects of a polluted environment than the wealthy. They are more likely to suffer serious consequences as a result of environmental degradation. To investigate viable solutions, it is necessary to first understand the sources of problems and how they interact. So, next slide is about the industrialization and urban air pollution. The early stages of urbanization and industrialization in developing countries are generally accompanied by rising incomes and worsening environmental conditions. Cross-sectional analysis of numerous countries at different levels of income suggests that some types of urban pollution tend first to rise with national income levels and then to fall. As noted earlier, this effect has been dubbed the environmental Kuznets curve, wherein the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis suggests that the environmental pollution increases at the beginning of economic growth. However, when it passes a certain level of income, the economic growth allows environmental remediation. So, according to the World Bank, even the worst quartile of high-income cities has lower pollution levels than the best quartile of low-income cities. Indeed, higher incomes make it easier to afford costly clean technologies. The trend, on the other hand, is not unavoidable. In both high and low income countries, the extent of government regulation is closely related to air and water quality. Furthermore, some environmental resources may be irreversibly lost unless immediate action is taken. Next, the principal sources of air pollution, which pose the greatest health threat associated with modernization, are energy use, vehicular emissions, and industrial production. Industrialization can lead to increases in waste, either directly through emissions or indirectly by altering patterns of consumption and boosting demand for manufactured goods. The production of manufactured goods generally entails the creation of byproducts that may be detrimental to the environment. The degree to which they degrade the environment will be determined by a variety of factors, including the type of byproducts produced, their quantity, and their disposal method. Unfortunately, in the absence of regulation, the most cost-effective way to dispose of unwanted byproducts is to release them untreated into the air and waterways, or to dump them on the ground, where runoff can easily sink into groundwater or wash into rivers. Changes in consumption patterns and their environmental consequences are likely to appear first in cities as a result of broader transmission of ideas, increased availability of goods, and increased incomes. We have already discussed externalities and how many of the costs of pollutants are borne by someone other than the polluter. This implies that the price paid for consuming a good is less than the social cost associated with the good. The typical supply and demand curves are depicted in Figure 10.6. However, in this case, we have marked the supply curve S is equals to MCP because it represents the marginal private costs of producing good X. QM and PM are the free market equilibrium output and price, respectively. If there are externalities associated with each unit of good X's consumption or production, the MCP curve does not represent the true cost of the good to society. If each unit of good X costs a third party $2, we can calculate the true marginal social cost curve MCS by imposing a $2 per unit sales tax on the output. This pollution tax raises the private cost curve to MCS by $2 at each point in Figure 10.6. Then Q is the efficient outcome and P is the price of the new intersection of the demand curve and the marginal social cost curve. As a result of factoring in the social cost of pollution, the actual output of the polluting product is reduced to the socially optimal level, while the price charged to the consumer rises from PM to P, and the price received by the producer falls from PM to PC. The burden of the pollution tax is shared by both consumers and producers, depending on the relative elasticities of the demand and supply curves. The consumer pays AB and the producer pays BC of the AC tax in figure 10.6. Then next slide, the problems of congestion, clean water, and sanitation. As serious as rising levels of industrial pollution may be to the health of urban dwellers in developing countries, the the two most important environmental factors affecting the health of the urban poor are a lack of clean water and sanitation. So first, high health and economic costs associated with environmental degradation. Drag on development. So the health and economic costs of this condition are enormous and they represent formidable barriers to improving living standards. The enormous economic costs of lost productivity and costly medical care are a drag on economic development. The next is impact on the poor. Although higher income households have access to either publicly or privately provided services, the poorest have no access to either. This is frequently due to the illegal status of much low-income housing, which makes it ineligible for government services and makes investing in upgrading equipment risky for private individuals. As a result, the majority of the poor are forced to buy contaminated water from vendors at a cost that is 10 times that of piped water. Next is private wells have led to land subsidence and flooding. Postponing investments in the infrastructure needed to provide urban water and sanitation may result in much higher costs in the future. Water scarcity has resulted in widespread use of private wells, which can strain existing groundwater supplies. And next is impact on export earnings. Contaminated water supplies may also pose a serious threat to foreign exchange earnings. Importing agricultural goods produced with potentially contaminated water may be prohibited by health standards in developed countries. Given these issues, it is not surprising that the cost of preventive measures are typically lower than the cost of lost revenues, resources, and infrastructure.
Next is the local and global costs of rainforest destruction. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that about 13 million hectares of forest were lost each year on average for the decade 2000 to 2010. Between 2015 and 2020, the rate of deforestation was estimated at 10 million hectares per year, down from 16 million hectares per year in the year 1990s. Deforestation contributes to global warming, loss of biodiversity, and loss of livelihood for people living in poverty. The opportunity costs arising from the preservation of rainforests will involve the loss of an important source of domestic fuel, foregone foreign exchange earnings from timber and beef, and the loss of a temporary solution to the problem of land shortages and population pressures. It is therefore unreasonable to assume that the few developing countries that contain the majority of remaining rainforests should be responsible for single-handedly providing this global public good. Indeed, when foreign countries are allowed a free ride, that is, if they are allowed to benefit from rainforest preservation without contributing to it, deforestation will continue at an undesirable pace. In order to reduce the resulting inefficiencies, the public goods model would suggest lowering the relative price per unit of protected forest for the developing country and increasing it for the outside beneficiaries. For the latter, this would entail the contribution of fees earmarked for the preservation of rainforests. Several steps must be taken to preserve the rainforests. Rainforest preservation and restoration will be in everyone's interest, therefore it is a global public good. Long-term solutions include increasing the accessibility of alternative fuels, managing sustainable timber programs, providing economic opportunities for impoverished people resorting to clearing tracts of fragile rainforest land, Debt for nature swaps or a voluntary transaction in which an amount of debt owed by a developing country government is cancelled or reduced by a creditor in exchange for the debtor making financial commitments to conservation. Lastly, funds for the preservation and maintenance of tropical rainforests.
Now into the last topic of this discussion. It is about policy options in developing and developed countries. So, what developing countries can do? There are a range of policy options. And first is proper resource pricing. It is the most obvious area for reform. It is likely the government pricing policy, including subsidies which can exacerbate resource scarcity or encourage unsustainable production methods. Next is community involvement. Environmental improvement initiatives are most likely to be effective when they collaborate with community networks to ensure that program design is consistent with both local and national goals. Development agencies' experience has shown that efforts can be more cost effective because they generally involve the use of low cost alternatives and provide employment to local populations. And next is clear property rights and resource ownership. Investments in household, sanitation, and water, as well as on farm improvements, frequently represent a large portion of the poor's lifetime savings, the loss of which can have severe economic consequences for households. As a result, a lack of secure tenure on rural or urban property can significantly impede investment in environmental improvement. Legalizing tenure can improve poor people's living conditions and increase agricultural investment. And next is programs to improve the economic alternatives of the poor. In many cases, further environmental devastation in rural areas could be avoided through on farm investments in irrigation and sustainable farming techniques, the use of alternative fuels, and the construction of erosion barriers. Governments can create alternative employment opportunities for the very poor by providing rural economic opportunities outside the home. For example, programs to build rural infrastructure like roads, storage facilities, etc., create local jobs, alleviate population pressures on ecological sensitive land, stimulate rural development, and reduce the flow of rural to urban migration. Next is raising the economic status of women. Improving women's educational attainment and expanding their economic options raise the opportunity cost of their time and may lead to a reduction in desired family size. Education also increases women's access to information about child nutrition and hygiene, which has been linked to rapid decreases in child mortality. And next is the industrial emissions abatement policies. For developing country governments to limit industrial pollution, a variety of policy options are available, including emission taxation, tradable emissions permits, quotas, and standards. And next is the proactive stance towards climate change and environmental degradation. Proactive policies can help the developing economy in general and the poor in particular become more resilient and adaptable to climate change, much of which is already unavoidable. Developing countries can build storm shelters, flood barriers, and protected roads and bridges, as well as promote reforestation and the restoration of natural ecosystem barriers such as mangroves. So, next, how developed countries can help developing countries. Industrial countries can help developing nations in their efforts to improve the environment of development in three areas. First is the trade liberalization. The urgent need to break the cycle of poverty and environmental destruction in developing countries is at the center of much current environmental debate. Eliminating trade barriers to developing country exports could significantly reduce absolute poverty by stimulating economic growth in the developing world, creating new jobs, and encouraging rural development. Next is debt relief. It is the access to international markets expands not only income but also the ability of heavily indebted countries to service their debt. Debt service consumes a significant portion of the funds available to developing country governments for domestic social programs, including those aimed at alleviating poverty and reducing environmental degradation. So, what is debt for nature swaps? So, debt for nature swaps offer an attractive and mutually beneficial way for the developing world to retire its foreign denominated debt while guaranteeing the protection of tropical rainforests. A debt for nature swap occurs when a foreign private environmental organization, such as the United States based Rainforest Alliance or the Nature Conservancy, works with a local environmental organization to purchase developing country debt on financial markets at a fraction of the base face value. So, and last is the development assistance. It is to achieve sustainable development. Developing countries require significant new development assistance. These funds would be used for a variety of programs aimed at alleviating poverty, providing services, and promoting sustainable production patterns. Additional aid from developing countries designated for these purposes could benefit developing country environments. So, what developed countries can do for the global environment? First, emission controls. Aside from responsible consumption, the developed world's greatest contribution to the global environment may be a clear demonstration of their own commitment to a cleaner environment. Because they continue to be the primary polluters of the air and sea, developed countries must pave the way for global changes in current and future production patterns. If wealthy nations do not achieve significant and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it will be difficult to persuade the developing world to do so, given that per capita emissions levels is in the developed world are far lower. Next is research and development. High-income countries must also take the lead in research and development initiatives. Growing public support in the industrialized world for stricter environmental regulation is likely to lead to the development of both cheaper emissions abatement technologies and cleaner manufacturing processes. Innovations resulting from R&D will boost efforts to reduce emissions if they are adopted in developing countries. Making cheaper, cleaner abatement technologies available to developing countries can help limit a major source of global emissions, the developing world's rapid industrialization. The availability of low carbon technologies will be critical in combating climate change. And lastly, import restrictions. The developed world has an indirect but significant impact on the global environment through its importation of products associated with environmentally unsustainable production. Treaties to limit the destruction of endangered resources will be ineffective if wealthy nations continue to provide lucrative markets for the sale of such goods. Import restrictions are a powerful tool for reducing unwanted international trade. And that is all. Thank you.